Oh yeah, Notorious Nelly. From our suggestions in Discord.
In 1931, a prominent St. Louis physician was kidnapped. It was a story that had become all too common during the throes of the Great Depression, but the kidnapping of Dr. Isaac Kelly was just the beginning of one of those truth stranger than fiction stories that Hollywood couldn't make up if they tried.
Oh.
The bizarre story of high society, of kidnapping, blackmail, baby theft, multiple celebrated trials centering around a flamboyant character called Notorious Nelly, is a tale so twisted that it would make a pirate blush. The throes.
Wait, we're gonna make pirate blushes? I'm scared. I'm scared, Mom.
Of the Great Depression led many, it seems, to resort to desperate means to make their living. The economic desperation, coupled with the effect of prohibition, led to a rise of crime syndicates and spikes in crime from bank robbery to homicide. Included among those crimes was kidnapping. St. Louis Public Radio noted in 2021 that the crimes became so depressingly common, the New York Times began publishing a regular feature called Recent Kidnappings in America. Wealthy families took out kidnap insurance. In the year 1932,
Wait, how bad would it have to be for them to like make actual insurance for this? Like, what the fuck? Like, that's insane. Like, yeah, we're just gonna have these up to the rate that we're gonna make some insurance for this. And even I'm like, how would they even calculate like how much the insurance is or how much they would cover to pay it? And like, what the fuck? Like, what? This is insane. Like, I can't.
there were an estimated 3,000 kidnappings for ransom in the United States. And St. Louis, a growing metropolis of more than 800,000 and center of trade in the heart of the country, was also the heart of the trend. St. Louis Public Radio notes, the city was dubbed the kidnap capital of America. The news of the kidnapping of Dr. Isaac Kelly, a Great War veteran and prominent physician of St. Louis, first broke on April 21st, 1931. The Kansas City Journal reported Dr. Isaac E. Kelly Jr., 44 years old, wealthy St. Louis physician, was believed to be held by kidnappers today, while St. Louis and St. Louis County authorities conducted a search for him. The paper reported that the doctor received a call at 9:30 p.m. the night before and had failed to return home. The paper noted that although high in his profession and wealthy, Kelly never hesitated to answer emergency calls. The call was apparently considered an emergency one by the physician. Shortly after the call, he had left in his black Lincoln coupe. So common was the kidnapping trend at the time that his wife simply assumed that his disappearance meant that he had been kidnapped. The paper reported, "I know he is kidnapped," his wife said. "He never failed to call me on the telephone when he was going to be out all night, no matter how important that case." There was reason that he would have been a target. Kelly, an eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist, was a wealthy man. Mrs. Kelly was an heiress to an oil fortune, and the paper reported, the Kellys have a large home on exclusive Portland Place and are socially prominent. It didn't take long for more evidence to appear. The United Press reported that the first clue came when the doctor's coupe, which he drove to answer what he believed to be an emergency call, was found abandoned at the side of a road 6 miles in the country. Footprints on the floor indicated 2 men had ridden with Dr. Kelly to that point, where the auto was abandoned. The United Press reported that Mrs. Kelly had expressed willingness to pay almost any ransom. But on the 28th, the case took a surprising turn. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported that Dr. Kelly had been turned over to one of their reporters, John T. Rogers. The Associated Press reported that police were working under the theory that a substantial ransom was paid, but the New York Times reported that Dr. Kelly and members of his family insist that no ransom was paid to the abductors, and that the surrender of the physician to a newspaper reporter on a lonely roadside on the outskirts of East St. Louis, Illinois, was not an act to which they were a party. It was a strange twist. The doctor indicated that he had written 3 letters while in captivity, asking first for $250,000 and then lowering the price to $150,000. But the family said that they had received no communications. When the doctor was released, the Times reported, no explanation was offered by the kidnappers. Rogers had no explanation either, insisting that he had simply received an anonymous phone call to pick up the doctor. The doctor offered to help investigators catch the perpetrators, but the Times noted it is doubtful whether he could ever identify any of his captors or direct the police to any of the places where he was held as a prisoner, because he had been blindfolded most of the time, and the only times when he was not blindfolded was when he was in a room with the windows covered, and at all times the guards were masked. The Times reported that the doctor himself was surprised that his family told him that no ransom had been paid. While saying that he felt a little rocky after the ordeal, he told the paper, "I'd certainly like to see these fellows today. Wouldn't I give them a laugh?" The police, however, had leads, and Joseph Girk, chief of the Metropolitan Police Department, insisted that the doctor's release by no means ended investigation of the case. "We will do everything possible to apprehend the guilty parties," he said. But the leads did not apparently pan out, because despite some accusations, no suspects were arrested, and the case was nearly forgotten, when another twist came, 3 years later. While newspapers typically describe a person by their age, not so with Adolf Fiedler, who was more notable for another reason. He was commonly described as the 440-pound justice of the peace of Maplewood, St. Louis County. The weighty justice, whom one headline described as Titanic, could be said to have had a checkered past, having been charged in 1928 with multiple crimes, including malfeasance in office and soliciting bribes. After one trial resulted in a hung jury, the charges were dropped before a second trial began. But Fiedler had a financial need and something to sell. The website of the Missouri Historical Society wrote, in February 1934, Fiedler approached John Rogers, the Post-Dispatch reporter who'd driven Kelly home after the kidnapping. Fiedler assured the reporter that for a price, he'd reveal where the kidnappers had kept their prisoner and who was involved. Fiedler owned what was described as a recreation parlor called the Arcade Country Club at Olive Street and North and South Roads in St. Louis, and he told the Post-Dispatch he knew most of the details of the Kelly kidnapping, as it was planned in his presence, although he denied taking any part in the abduction.
I'm sorry, what? You know about this thing happening. And then you choose to not say anything? Like, what? How does that even work? Like, I'm just, I don't understand. It makes no sense. So, the guy was kidnapped with a ransom of $250,000 back then, which is roughly worth $5,890,000, roughly. That's so he just knew about it, let them plan it, and just did nothing? Empanadas and nachos and everything delicious. This is absolutely fucking insane.
New York Times reported that Fiedler said he had his own reasons for turning up the gang and also hoped to sell his information to a newspaper and bolster his finances. He gave more details to the St. Louis Star-Times. Fiedler told a reporter recently that he could clear up a half-dozen big crimes in and around St. Louis, but that someone would have to pay him a lot of money to do so. He said he wanted to raise money to finance a trip to California and sustain himself there until he could make good in the movies. Because of his enormous girth, he weighed 325 pounds. He thought that he would develop into a novelty actor. And to be fair, good on him. The description of him being 325 pounds meant that he had lost some 115 pounds since he had been indicted in 1928. But the rotund justice of the peace's Hollywood aspirations aside, what he had to say about the kidnapping of Dr. Isaac Kelly would provide more twists to the story. Fiedler had implicated 8 men in the kidnapping of Dr. Kelly, although by that time the Times reported that 3 of the 8 men named by Dr. Fiedler in his affidavits were killed in gang shootings. The implication of participation by members of some of St. Louis's notorious gangs was not a surprise, and as of a February 8th story in the Times, 3 of the 5 had been arrested already and another was already in prison, with just 1 still at large. But Fiedler had accused, in addition, a woman, Mrs. Nelly Munch, described by the St. Louis Star-Times as the attractive, auburn-haired wife of Dr. Ludwig O. Munch. The Times wrote, the woman, the wife of a physician, was accused by Fiedler of aiding the kidnappers in selecting the socially prominent physician for a victim. But the Times continued, she refused to make a statement, but her husband called her arrest an outrage and said that she did not know any of the persons accused by Fiedler. The accusation of Munch was a startling twist. Not only was she a prominent member of St. Louis society and the wife of a doctor, but the Macon, Missouri Chronicle-Herald explained, Mrs. Nelly Tipton Munch was the daughter of a well-known Baptist minister. Moreover, the Chronicle-Herald continued, Mrs. Munch's family is prominent in central Missouri. Her brother is Supreme Court Judge Ernest Tipton. The trials of the 3 men accused were hardly tame. John C. Johnson, one of the men originally accused by Fiedler, had agreed to testify for the state. The Post-Dispatch reported that 4 days after his arrest, Johnson had agreed to testify and had identified the other 3 defendants. Johnson's confession and testimony had been confirmed by Dr. Kelly, after Johnson reminded him of several incidents occurring during Kelly's captivity. Johnson's testimony had been kept secret by the prosecution, but apparently not secret enough. On May 12, 1934, Johnson was killed by machine gun fire outside the home of a deputy sheriff, where he'd been in protective custody. 2 members of the notorious St. Louis Shelton gang were eventually convicted of his murder. Still, the 3 men who had been apprehended were convicted of the kidnapping and other crimes. But the story was different for Nelly Munch. St. Louis Post-Dispatch writer Florence Schrinkel wrote of Munch in 1983, Nell's ancestry was staunch, native Missouri for 3 generations back on both sides. She was descended from some of the Boone and Callaway counties' first settlers. One of the women, Elizabeth Moss, had married William Ashelm, the first lieutenant governor of Missouri. William Mosh Tipton, Nell's father, was a veteran of the Confederate Army, a very partisan Democrat and a Baptist minister who preached for 40 years in central and northeast Missouri. Her accusation was, a New York Daily News article opined, incongruous. For 22 years, Mrs. Munch had been one of St. Louis's best people. Although not wealthy, the Munches had been comfortably situated, had traveled in quiet social circles, and had been accepted as gentlefolk by their friends and acquaintances. But Munch was not all that she appeared to be. For example, she had run a dress salon in St. Louis called Mitzi's, and while the shop catered to the wealthy, it had a seamy side. The shop was said to be a place where wealthy men would frequent to buy things for their mistresses. And if that was not seamy enough, Schinkel notes, there were some very unkind rumors circulating among the socialite patrons of her dress shop. Rumors about how she had made a practice, in conducting the Mitzi shop, of sending bills to widows for clothing she asserted that their late husbands had bought for other women. That is, she was rumored to take advantage of widows, giving them fake bills she knew that they would pay to protect their recently deceased husbands from scandal. Fiedler would later say that she had been given the nickname Goldie for her love of money. Despite those rumors and other accusations including fraud and jewelry theft, Munch had powerful friends. Among her supporters was Dr. Marsh Pitzman, who had visited the Munch home many times, caring for one of their house guests. He told the Post-Dispatch that she had won his respect. For many months she treated me with quiet reserve. A cultured woman shows a physician making a professional call in her home. But she also got help defending herself from the kidnapping charge. Schinkel writes that, sister of a beloved Missouri Supreme Court judge, she received free services of 22 of the most prominent lawyers of the day. Fiedler had not just accused her of being involved. He had said that she was central to the scheme, being the finger woman who selected Dr. Kelly and concocting the story to draw him out of his home. For her part, she was quoted in the St. Louis Globe-Democrat saying, "I can't understand why a man I do not even know should select my name from a million people to name as a kidnapper." Her legal team won a significant victory, the Globe-Democrat reported. After several attempts to quash the charges and get a change of venue, Mrs. Munch's attorney succeeded in getting her trial moved to the town of Mexico, Missouri, Mrs. Munch's childhood home. It was a great advantage to move the trial to her hometown, where her father had been a respected minister and close enough to the state capitol in Jefferson City that her brother, the state Supreme Court justice, could sit next to her. But she had another trick as well. Nelly Munch, 44 years old and married 23 years without a child, announced that she was pregnant. A gift, she said, from the Lord. The child was born shortly before the trial began. Munch had gambled on the idea that the jury would not convict a new mother, and that gamble worked. Despite evidence from Fiedler, as well as testimony from others who had seen her in the company of the other kidnappers, Munch was acquitted. The Globe-Democrat wrote that on October 5th, 1935, when the verdict was delivered, Mrs. Munch leapt joyously to her feet, embraced her husband, who had remained steadfastly by her side, and shouted, "I was not guilty. The jury has vindicated me." A United Press headline proclaimed that the acquittal ends a bizarre case. But the case would become even more bizarre. Just 10 days later, Munch was back in court. The Globe-Democrat reported Mrs. Munch was allowed little time in which to rejoice over acquittal of the abduction charges. On October 15th, she was ordered to appear before Special Commissioner Rush H. Limbaugh in response to the habeas corpus of a Miss Ware regarding possession of her baby boy, whom she claimed Mrs. Munch was palming off on the public as a child of her own flesh and blood. The Charleston, Missouri Enterprise-Courier opined, "It occurred to us, when we read of Mrs. Ellie Tipton Munch giving birth to a baby last month after 23 years and having never borne a child and being in her 40s, that everything was just not above the board." Testimony made it clear that the child was not hers, with the commissioner reporting to the Court of Appeals that the indication of all testimony was that the child had been born by Mrs. Ware and had been speared away by baby procurer Wilfred Jones. Ware had been promised that the child would be adopted by a wealthy and respected couple, but she had figured out that the baby had gone to Munch, and she cried foul. The baby was returned to Ware. The trial before the Court of Appeals found many shocking facts, including that Nelly had had her maid produce a special girdle with a pouch that she could stuff to appear to be pregnant, and that her husband had performed minor surgery on her to make it appear that she had given birth. Even more shocking, it was revealed that the Ware child was not the first baby that she had procured. Another baby had been procured in St. Louis by paying the mother $50, but the child had died in the hospital. Another trial followed, charging that Nelly...
So they just got like an underground baby black market? Is this what I'm getting? Am I understanding this? Hollywood could never top this. Like, what the fuck?
Dr. Munch, Jones, and another person with conspiring to unlawfully transfer custody of the Ware baby. Then came another twist. A witness, Mrs. Grace Caroline Tomlinson, who had accompanied Jones when he picked up the baby, told the court that the baby was part of a scheme to obtain $250,000 from Dr. Marsh Pitzman. That is, apparently treating him with the quiet reserve of a cultured woman, as he had put it, meant having a torrid and sexual...
So, when I saw the title of this, I wasn't sure what to expect. I wasn't expecting us to go into a very complicated, very heavily layered crime, but also, like, I wasn't expecting us to be going to the levels of, like, that there's, like, a baby black market kind of thing going on here just for trying to get money. Like, which I find it wild, especially when I look at, like, how much $250,000 back then is worth today. I just find it absolutely insane.
Affair with him. Having convinced him that the child was his, he had then changed his will to create a $250,000 trust for she and the baby. The conspiracy trial was declared a mistrial when an attempt to bribe a juror in order to hang the jury was revealed. But in a second trial, all four were found guilty and fined. But there was one more trial to come. In the testimony for the conspiracy trial, a series of love letters between Munch and Dr. Pitzman had come to light. And as she had used the mail to perpetrate her fraud on Dr. Pitzman, who had advanced her $18,000, all four were charged with the federal crime of mail fraud. The day after Christmas, 1936, they were found guilty.
And mail
Nelly was
fraud?
sentenced to 10 years in prison. Dr. Ludwig Munch was sentenced to 8.
Damn.
After her conviction, the Post-Dispatch wrote, Mrs. Munch demurred when she was told that she must surrender her expensive mink coat, but jailer O'Meara was firm. He assured her that he would consult a furrier before sending it off for fumigation with other garments. While it was the great baby hoax that attracted the nationwide headlines, it was actually the kidnapping spree, including Dr. Kelly, but also notably the kidnapping and death of Charles Lindbergh's son, that probably had the largest effect. As to address the problem, Congress greatly expanded the powers of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Munches divorced while they were in prison. After his release, Dr. Munch regained his medical license and practiced in his hometown of Washington, Missouri, until his death in 1966. Nelly Tipton Munch, after her release, moved to California, changed her name to Nelly Lee Wormington. She passed away in 1982. Schinkel said of her, when she was good, she was very, very good. But when she was bad, she created the juiciest scandal of that depression-ridden decade. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can.
Man, that's wild. That's so wild.